Hello, my name's Chris. What's yours? Welcome back to Marathon Man, where I'm going through the history of James Bond, looking at every novel and film in release order, as well as doing little pit stops along the way to look at various other media that may have come out in between. And you join me at Ian Fleming's fifth Bond novel, From Russia with Love. In my video for Diamonds Are Forever, I did mention that I've always kind of felt that that one caps off, if you like, the first era of James Bond novels, whereas this one begins a new chapter. I do still feel like there is a distinct shift in the series at this point, but rereading From Russia with Love this time, I was struck by the idea that actually this feels not just distinct from what came before, but what comes afterwards as well. If people even separate Fleming's novels into distinct eras, then given how this one ends, you could point to this one as being like the end of the first era before Dr. No begins like an era of supervillains in Dr. No himself, Goldfinger and Blofeld. But those first four books, Casino Royale, Live and Let Die, Moonraker and Diamonds Are Forever, definitely feel markedly different from what Fleming seemed to be trying here. Yes, there is connective tissue here, of course there is. I mean, we get a reappearance from Mathis at the end of the book, and when we first meet Bond, he's sort of like reflecting on the collapse of his relationship with Tiffany Case from the previous book. And the villain's plot against Bond is brought about because he managed to thwart Le Chiffre, Mr. Big and Drax. So I'm not saying it's like a hardline reboot or anything, it's just that this novel is constructed in a way that's so different from the first four that it does feel like the series is evolving. It's been reported that Fleming was tiring of Bond at this point. Now, reading this book with that in mind, I mean, you can kind of see it. Bond doesn't appear at all for the first third of the book, and Fleming apparently kills him off at the end. But I think I've only ever read that reported rather than seeing a direct quotation from Fleming himself. And this book definitely doesn't feel like it's written by a man bored. He takes time and care over the plot and the characters. The villains are set up perfectly in the first third of the book, but also later on, so is the man that Bond will come to meet in Turkey, Darko Karim. Karim is a phenomenal character. Now, it's very easy to take issue with Bond's assessment of him as a wonderful man, even after we find about a specific episode from Karim's youth where he was particularly abusive to a young woman. And I will address that. But Fleming's writing of Karim and Bond's affection for him is, on a technical level, very, very skillful. Because when we do learn about this episode from Karim's youth, it adds a whole bucket load of contradictions. And Fleming is mindful to include Karim's mother finding out about this and absolutely losing it with him. So you do get the sense, on some level, that Karim was chastised and learnt the error of his ways. But whether or not Karim did learn the error of his ways, what Fleming has done is he's created this overtly friendly, lovely man, but given him like a heck of a dark side. Failures, and then, like I say, lots of contradictions. So he kind of leaves it up to the reader whether or not to forgive Karim. Fleming depicts that episode of Karim's past very, very starkly, matter-of-factly. These are the facts, this is what happened. And then he doesn't really judge the reader in whatever conclusions they come to. I mean, obviously, personally, I read that and thought Karim was a bit of a bastard. And so it does make me wonder why Bond likes him so much, even after he's found that out. However, the fact that Bond likes him isn't in question. So here we have another complex character, a real person. And in terms of the story and the time we spend with Karim, Fleming brings him to life incredibly well. More than Mathis, more than Leiter, Karim is probably the most well-drawn of Bond's allies in the novel series so far. And part of that may well be because of that complex cauldron of contradictions that he is. He feels more living and breathing, whether or not the reader chooses to like him. And this literary dexterity extends to the rest of the book as well. Bond is not in that first third of the book at all, but it still makes for compelling reading. As the plan is drawn up to assassinate Bond and in the process humiliate the Secret Service. Each of the villains is gifted time and care to let them breathe, and therefore feel like a threat. I mentioned how Diamonds Are Forever lacked a main villain and instead treated the Spangled Mob as the villain, and how that was kind of to the story's detriment. Now the same could be argued here. There's no main villain to speak of, just the entity of Smersh out to get Bond. Except here it's to the story's credit. With a considerable amount of the book given over to their plot coming together, the collective feels like Bond is in very real danger. That first third, where the various players are introduced, brought to life, they all meet up, they start concocting their plot, is very vividly written. And by the time we meet Bond, because we've spent so long with the villains and understanding their plot, he already feels up against it, without knowing it. As with the Spangle Mob and Serafimo Spang, you could, if you wanted to, point to one of the villains as the main villain. But if you're anything like me, you'll do that and then remember another one and sort of end up flip-flopping between them. But your mileage may vary. For me, if you were to pick a main villain out of this book, it comes down to either Rosa Klebb or Donovan Grant. Grant is set up as a force to be reckoned with, a villain who is actually genuinely unsettling. His backstory is really interesting, and Fleming crafts him into a very formidable foe, one who poses a different kind of threat to Bond. Mr. Big was physically intimidating, but did use his brains more. Le Chiffre and Drax were more intellectually inclined villains, and the Spangle Mob were more about brute force. Here, with Smersh made up of several people, all key to executing the plot against Bond, each player can take on different attributes. And while Grant may pose a more physical threat to Bond than a mental one, his sheer madness is enough to psych the hero out. For me, Grant is the most interesting of all of Fleming's villains so far, impossible to reason with and unlikely to survive an encounter with. And when he reappears again towards the end of the book, pretending to be somebody else, Fleming never divulges that it's Grant by naming him. But we do know that it's him because he's been set up so deftly at the beginning, Fleming doesn't even need to name him. And because he isn't named as Grant, the reader gets to feel quite clever for having worked it out. And it makes Bond feel in even more danger. Fleming creates an atmosphere where we want to physically reach into the book and shake Bond and say that Captain Nash isn't who he says he is. It is a really clever bit of writing. Klebb is brought to life no less expertly. She is loathsome, a true grotesque of a James Bond villain, and a penchant for murder and torture mark her out to be a really hateful baddie. So even just between her and Grant, the villains of this book are infinitely more successful creations than the ones in the previous one. She is set up as less of a physical threat, but in a neat turn of events, she actually manages to be the one who bests Bond in a fight. Sure, yeah, she's overpowered and taken away, but not before she manages to poison Bond and apparently kill him. It's a hell of a cliffhanger. The impact may be robbed from some of us knowing full well that this isn't where the story ended, but reading this book in the year of publication, who's to say what we would have thought reading that humdinger of a final line? Bond pivoted slowly on his heel and crashed headlong to the wine-red floor. The end. As it is, even knowing full well that this isn't where the story ended, it still does have some impact. Fleming has Bond tantalisingly close to getting out of it. He's managed to, against all odds, wriggle out of the assassination plot against him, kill his would-be assassin, and alert his people to the presence of a booby trap. He's discovered how to get close to one of the higher-ups of Smersh, Klebb, and is able to have her brought in. He is just about to make it home okay. And then Fleming ends the book as he loses consciousness after having had a fatal dose of poison. It's a cruel ending, and that cruelty pierces the knowledge that there are more James Bond adventures to come. The shock of Bond apparently dying is superseded by the brutality of ending the book in that way, so it still does pack a punch. It's a long way off on this marathon yet, but I'm one of those fans who had no real issue with how No Time to Die ended. When I watched that film in the cinema and it ended that way, I was reminded of how Fleming chose to end this novel. And so in a way, it did feel like it was within the Bond wheelhouse to end a story like that. Now, I get it, it's infinitely more explicit in No Time to Die. There is no room for Bond's survival there. Daniel Craig's Bond is definitively dead. And I do understand why some people may have a problem with ending a James Bond film that way. It's just that the audacity of it feels in line with with Fleming's audacity here, and so it doesn't really rub me up the wrong way. But like I say, long way off yet for that conversation. As for From Russia with Love, well, the way this book is built is really fantastic. By the time Bond enters the fray, the villains are several steps ahead of him, as are we. And there is great mileage to be had in the reader knowing things that Bond does not. It adds to the jeopardy and the real affection that Bond nurtures for Karim, regardless of what the reader thinks about Karim, is really rather touching in that it blossoms in circumstances that are far more treacherous than either Bond or Karim think they are. He also develops real feelings for Tatiana as well, the Russian who is sent as part of Smersh's plan. To some degree, unknowingly, she's fully aware that she's got an objective, she just doesn't know the whole plan. So obviously this will carve her out as fairly sympathetic to the reader, so when she and Bond forge a very real connection, it feels like a ray of light in an otherwise murky scheme. It's also quite characteristic of the James Bond of the books. Now, I've said several times that if your familiarity with James Bond as a character is via the films, then you'll probably be surprised by the character in the books. When we meet him, he's full of regret over how things worked out with Tiffany Case. She spent months living with him. They were in a long-term relationship, and he's definitely stated as missing her now that she's left him to go back to America. And he's all in his head as well about Tatiana's true motivations. Not like a teenage boy, it's just that the inherent mistrust he has as a spy is most definitely at war with the feelings he has as a man. This is described brilliantly by Fleming, and while I said it doesn't come across that Bond is behaving like a schoolboy through Fleming's writing, it does take on a kind of schoolboy charm, as Bond falls for Tatiana enough to want to listen to his feelings as a man over his mistrust as a spy. So again, we're not given the image of a man just wanting to get his leg over. Now yes, of course, he does want to get his leg over. He's James Bond, of course he does. I'm not saying that that isn't an ingredient in his character, but what I am saying is that it's not the main ingredient. He has real feelings which Fleming doesn't shy away from, and given his experiences with Vesper in Casino Royale and how that informs his relationships with the female leads in subsequent books, the romantic side of James Bond actually becomes one of the more detectable through lines of the novels, and therefore a cornerstone of the character, rather than just being a heartless machine like many perceive him to be from the films. Again, I'm getting ahead of myself a bit, but it's a key factor in Brosnan's Bond. With Paris Carver and Electra King, they tap into the complex romantic feelings the Bond of the books is very much capable of. So with his fifth Bond novel, Fleming brings the changes and then some. This is like no Bond novel before it, and like no other Bond novel since. Yeah, there will be some more stark outliers that will come along as we go on, but out of these first 5 books, From Russia with Love is the one that is most unique, and very special as a result. The opening third, as Smersh's players are introduced and their plot formed, is expertly crafted and bold enough to not include Bond at all, but I think I might have to go for how Fleming weaves Grant after that stellar introduction at the start of the book back into proceedings towards the book's climax without even having to name him. Masterful. The snapshot of Kerim's actions as a younger man does taint him somewhat. They mark him out as a very complicated character and therefore make him feel quite real as a result. So this isn't a criticism of Fleming's writing, more just a personal issue when it comes to fully adoring a character to the extent that Bond does. Again, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this peek behind the Iron Curtain, then you know how YouTube works. Please do give it a like and share it around. It'd be great to get as many James Bond fans along for the Supermarathon ride as possible. And what do you think of From Russia with Love? Is it an exciting shift in the series and the beginning of something new, or should Fleming have stuck to business as usual? Can you see why this was one of JFK's favourite books, or is it a dull plodding story with not enough Bond in it at the beginning? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you back here soon for a look at the time a game show host played James Bond. So, if you don't want to miss that, hit the subscribe button and we'll nip over to South Africa.